Well, hello. Here we are, another great edition of Kato Reviews. But first, I'm looking good, feeling good, loving life. I hope you can say the same today. My guest, he is an international traveler. He is a huge star all over the world. He is Mr. Sam Adonis. Sam?
Wonderful
Today?
I am great. Wonderful to be here with you.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and just jump right into it.
Jump right in. Let's do it.
How did the love of wrestling start for you?
Oof, this is a question I've been asked a bunch of times, and I've never really had an answer to that. My dad and my brother were pretty much ate up and obsessed with wrestling my entire life. So there's never been a specific point where I can remember being introduced to wrestling. I think most babies play with Elmo toys or Barney toys. I had the big rubber Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. So I can't really think about a specific point when it was introduced to me, but I know since I was a baby I loved it. Funny about that, instead of watching Barney videos, I had the Hulkster Coliseum video, 1 hour tape I watched religiously every day. So that's pretty much all I've ever known, all I've ever wanted, and pretty much structured who I am today.
Did you have any favorites growing up?
I would say definitely Hulk Hogan as a baby. I'm talking 1 or 2 years old. I was just obsessed with it and ate up with it. It was weird because we had so many videos. My parents, my brother and my dad always taped like the old Clash of the Champions or the Saturday Night's Main Events. So being born in '89, my wrestlers that I came up with would have been like Rick Martel, Razor Ramon, Ric Flair in WWF 91, 92. But I watched more of the videos from '85, '86. I had a bunch of Memphis tapes. I had some old Bruno Sammartino tapes. So I was just always watching other things that weren't really current at that point in time. But because of that and the toys that I had, I was just pretty much obsessed with everybody.
Okay. I mean, I find it fascinating that, you're born in '89, you're a very young guy yet, and yet, you're mentioning Hogan, you're mentioning Bruno. What do you think sort of attracted you to these guys that were from an era maybe before your era?
It was something for me. I was fascinated by the characters and who they were. And we had 1 million wrestling magazines and toys. We had every wrestling toy you could imagine at that point. And I had some sort of imagination that, I guess it's good like most kids do, but I wasn't thinking about fairy tales or Masters of the Universe. I was thinking about, other wrestlers. There has to be more wrestlers out there. There has to be something that I don't know about. So I used to cut out pictures of wrestlers I didn't know in the magazines, and I'd color them. So I used to have just a stack of wrestlers that, you wouldn't even know. I didn't know who they were, but I was fascinated by them and just always kept looking for more. And then later on, it really led me down the line. From watching WCW, I found, the luchadors and the Japanese wrestlers. ECW came out, and at probably 5 years old, Kensuke Sasaki was my favorite wrestler, which was not normal for a 5-year-old American kid. And then taking me to Ultimo Dragon, Rey Mysterio, Great Sasuke, whatever it may be. That fascination of something else always took me down a different line, and it made me study a little bit more and really fall in love with wrestling as a whole instead of just being a fan.
After some time watching wrestling, you became a fan. I'm assuming you became a fan of independent wrestling. How'd you first find out about indie wrestling?
When I was really young, it's probably been about 1991 or 1992, my dad ended up buying a few independent fundraisers when he was a fire chief in West Newton, Pennsylvania, which actually still has wrestling, funnily enough. He built that town 25 years ago, but either way, these shows, it added to the interest, it added to the fascination because it was, holy cow, what is this? This is wrestling in this high school gym at the fire hall here? It's these guys. I don't remember enough about it. Chances are most of them were probably pretty terrible if they were indie wrestlers in 1991. But, I was obsessed with it because it was different. It was something new. And that opened my eyes and made me want to look for more, That was pretty much the beginning of it. But from then on out, we developed into going to the PWX shows early on at Eastland Mall. ECW was in all the magazines, and it was kind of independent before independent was cool, and being a part of that and really going to the events when they came to Pittsburgh really opened my eyes to what independent wrestling was, and it all just kind of added fuel to the fire of my fascination for international pro wrestling.
So when you're first around independent wrestling, is there any guys that sort of really caught your interest? Were when you were a teenager, was there indie guys that you really sort of liked?
We got a long way to go before we get to the teenage Sam years, but when I was a kid, funnily enough, one of my favorites recently just passed away. Ron the Beast Williams was one of my favorites.
Sure.
JB Destiny, Sean the Shocker Evans, Paul Atlas, Brian Anthony. That probably would have been my number one hero as a kid. And I love him to death to this day, but he was PWX champion at the time. He was the bad boy Brian Anthony. And at that point in time, he was on a different level. He was one that we knew, if we would go to an independent show at Eastland Mall, there was something about him that was a level above. You could get why he was the champion. He was the one that spent the most time in the gym. He had the tan. He had the look. He had the boots. He had the persona. It was like having your own version of Shawn Michaels here in Pittsburgh. And this is back before the internet, before, everybody studied everything about the indies. And for me, there was something about it. I liked the guys on TV, but Brian Anthony was my guy. So that was pretty cool.
Thinking back on those guys now, you've been around the business a long time. When you think of any of those guys, are you surprised that any of them didn't make it bigger than what they did?
I think a ton of them. It's funny, though, because I think the term making it is very subjective. I think some guys, in my eyes right now, I've made it. I've done so much of what I've wanted to do that I can stop today and be very happy. I think it's a shame that, most wrestling fans now claim to know so much more than they have any idea. And the fact if it wasn't filmed or if it wasn't put on YouTube, 10 years ago, it never happened. But you can have guys like, Brian Anthony or T. Ranchula or Paul Atlas, many of these Pittsburgh guys that have had, wrestled in the Dallas Sportatorium or, in Florida or worldwide, have an NWA title shot. And because wrestling as a whole now doesn't acknowledge it, it's almost like it never happened. So I think, I think I'm a lot of the way that I am because of the guys that I grew up around, outside of wrestling, the wrestlers that have, shaped me into who I am. But, there's plenty of guys here in Pittsburgh that have done a lot, and I'm proud to have grown up with a lot of them.
So you mentioned that maybe, I think when I asked that question, like the difference between what you've done, where, maybe you're not where you want to be yet to the ultimate level of fame, but, I think about a guy like, you mentioned him, Paul Atlas, who, whenever I first met Paul Atlas in the late 90s, I thought, holy cow, this guy is something. But like he certainly wasn't a star on the same level as you were. So I guess to get back to my question, are you surprised they didn't make it to another level, perhaps?
Not really. I just think the wrestling business has different levels and different processes for everybody. Like I said, how many 5-year-old kids' favorite wrestler was Kensuke Sasaki? Clearly my goals and aspirations were going to be different than other people's. I always wanted to wrestle outside the United States. I always felt like creating that name in Japan or Mexico is going to get me to a different level here in the United States, whereas a lot of the guys had no desire to do that, and realistically, if I never wanted to do that, chances are I'd be in a different position here in the United States as we speak. So maybe these guys did what they wanted to do in their path, and, who knows why they didn't make it. They may have not wanted to make it as much as they think they wanted to make it. But, being here in Pittsburgh, you only have so many opportunities. And, some people decide to have a wife and kids. Some people, have a really good job they can't get away from. Either way, I don't think that dictates, what they got out of their career because, you know as well as I do, this is the best profession on earth. And I'm sure there's some of these guys in this list that, they might never have been WWE champion, but they could probably say they've had a better life than most of the people they know.
At a certain point, your brother was very young when he started to train to wrestle. Do you have any memories of when that happened, and how did you feel about it when he first started to train?
I've just been so obsessed with wrestling my entire life, but it's been because of my brother. It's just like playing with Ninja Turtles together. It's what I'm sure you have your things with your brother, you do. But wrestling's always been the common ground. So when he started to train, I was just the number one supporter. I was such a big fan of his. I used to get excited to watch my brother referee. I'd go to the PWX shows to see referee Richard Long and be, wow, that's my brother right there, which is cool, So I've always felt, I've always kind of accepted it as my role to be little brother. And, after a while, it kind of took on a life of its own because I was so obsessed on every aspect of wrestling. I kind of became the little sidekick of Matt and became Little Sam, if you will. And my obsession with wrestling kind of just, followed with me. And being a part of his journey, in a sense, was my journey as well. Because the people that were his associates and the people that were bringing him into wrestling were indirectly teaching me the ways of the business as well, even when I was 10, 12, or 13 years old.
So funny to hear yourself call yourself Little Sam, because that's how I first met you, Little Sam.
Yeah.
And Doe and I were talking about this in our interview. Whenever I interviewed Doe, the same thing, Little Sam. We both kind of agreed that at this point, Little Sam can kick both our asses pretty quick. It's so funny that people out here still think of you as Little Sam. Does that bother you at all?
Not at all. It's who I was. It's made me who I am. And the cool thing is, I say to everybody, whether it's you yourself or Doe or my brother's friends, Quinn Magnum, Brian Anthony, T. Ranchula, these guys made me who I am. So being around that rough and tough pro wrestling environment, and I mean, I'm by no means a veteran. I'm younger than a lot of the guys here in Pittsburgh. But when I was 10 years old, in 1999 or 12 in 2001, wrestling was a lot different than it is now. So me being a 12-year-old kid in the locker room in 2001 kind of opened your eyes and ears to some things that most 12-year-olds aren't normally being a part of. So I think that, that on-the-job experience, if you will, just as a Little Sam backstage, kind of shaped the way for the future for me to have my success in what I've done in wrestling.
You were around IWC during a time when your brother was there where so many great future stars sort of came through. The CM Punks and the list goes Colt Cabana, and the list goes on. It's Chris Hero, all these guys. I mean, as a wrestling fan, a teenage wrestling fan, what was that like for you to be around these guys who are in the magazines, on the internet, on Ring of Honor television? What was that like for you?
At the time, I absolutely loved it because I look back at it and I was a part of such a real crew. But it's funny because every name you just mentioned knows Matt's little brother Sam. I specifically remember outside the steps of the Monroeville Courttime Sports Center, Monroeville Sports Center, arguing, passionately arguing with CM Punk about Tenru. And I didn't like Tenru at the time. And Punk says, "What are you talking about, kid? You're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about." But the funny thing to me is I was arguing at 12 years old with CM Punk about Tenru. And to me, that kind of puts things into perspective that anybody that ever wants to, shortcut me and what I've done and my passion or doubt anything, all you have to do is, if you were there, if you were around me at that point in time, you knew it wasn't really that normal for a kid, a little fat kid at 12 years old to know and love and think about wrestling the way that I did. So that passion just, kind of grew into what it was. But again, it is because of the people I was around. So I can't say I was brought up around CM Punk and Chris Hero and Colt Cabana, but they were such good friends with my brother at that point in time, and I was an extension of my brother that, in a sense, I was around them enough to say that, that they definitely shaped me a little bit in some form.
Near as I could remember, so correct me if I'm wrong, you started more or less training around 2007. Does that sound close to being right?
No, would have to back down a little bit before that. 2004, I began training. We bought our ring in 2003, and the summer of 2004, we actually had my ring set up in my yard. And that was the first summer that my brother had all the boys coming over, and it was it wasn't an official training situation or scenario, but it was, hey, let's start messing around with Sammy and getting him ready.
You were young, 14.
I was 14 as well, and I know you remember, I was a fat kid. I was, I graduated high school with 300 pounds, so I was a big, big boy. But luckily, I was always kind of, I can't say naturally athletic, but I was naturally accepting to the way pro wrestling works on your body. I don't know if it was something, subconscious. I've seen so much of it, or I was around it so much. It wasn't natural how I could barely run the bases in a baseball field, but I could take a snap flip bump better than the other 5 guys in the class. So, I was taught a little bit at a time from then on. And then, let's see, it probably would have been about 2005 would be when we opened up the wrestling school in for my dad.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when the training really started. My first match would have been February of 2008.
Okay.
But at that point, I'd already been training for the better part of 4 years. But there was a knee injury in there, so.
So, I guess the big question I have is, I can't imagine what it's like to be trained by your brother. Not your brother specifically. I mean, anybody's brother training them to be a wrestler. What were the pros and the cons of learning wrestling from your brother?
I don't think there was a single con about learning from my brother, because the cool thing was, at that point in time when he was training me, he was pretty much the best recognized wrestler in Pittsburgh. His experience level, what he knew, and he was good at what he did. So, from that standpoint, there was nothing, I was going to get the best wrestling education from him. The best parts about it was, I think we kind of had a chemistry, because he knew I wanted it worse than anybody else. He never had to stay on me. He was a little bit harder on me in the point where he expected more from me. He wouldn't tolerate less. He wouldn't want me to be blown up. I had to lead the class by example because I was his little brother. But because of that, I was able to step up and become a better wrestler. But I think, again, anybody that would have worked out with us at that point in time, everybody knew that I had a special connection with wrestling that most of them didn't. The fact that I loved wrestling, the passion kind of outgrew the rest of it. So that definitely added to the experience of being trained by my brother. 2008,
you had your first match. What are your memories of that first match?
I remember my gear looked like a pair of a plastic garbage bag. I had some pleather trunks that my dad made me, or that my mom made me, and they actually were a bit too big for me. I'm pretty sure my butt came out at some point in that match. But I wrestled Ashton Amherst, and I remember going 1.5 million miles an hour. We went 8 minutes, but it felt like about 2.5. And it was in Mill Hall, PA, which is out by your neck of the woods.
Sure, I remember. I think I was there for that night.
You might have been. I think you might have been a license for that one. But that was the first night for me, and it just seems so long ago.
Do you feel like you were ready at that point to have your first match?
Yeah, I wish I would have been a little bit more better prepared. I think at that point I was happy that my dad was a promoter and my brother was my brother. So I really was like, yeah, I'm good at this. I can get away with what I want. Looking back, I was just a fat kid and some crappy tights, and just doing what I thought was good. There was a long point in time where I did kind of hide behind the fact that my dad was a promoter. I would have been able to I should have taken it more seriously, getting ready for it. I didn't really realize the expectations my brother would have had. I could have gotten into the gym earlier. I could have debuted as, wow, here's Corey's little brother. You're Matt's little brother. Wow, I'm even doing it to myself now. But I could have come out a little bit better and had a better first outing. And for a while, I was kind of just, yeah, whatever. I'm good at what I do. And, I was always kind of happy with what I was able to deliver as a fat kid, that I didn't really need to, or I felt like I didn't need to take it seriously and work out and get a better presentation. But hindsight being 2020, I would not put 18-year-old Sam on one of my shows that I produce now. So,
besides being in better shape, if I could send you back in time today and you could give yourself any advice about, not just about that match, but everything that's went on throughout the future, of everything you've done in wrestling, what advice would you give yourself today?
I would probably have told myself to shut up. I've always been very passionate about wrestling, and at the same time, I've used the fact that I've studied so much wrestling to my advantage, and a lot of times, I might not have been incorrect in some of the things I would have been saying. However, it's really hard for me to accept, when I was 18 years old, that maybe this 25-year-old veteran, even though he's a Pittsburgh guy, doesn't need to be told by an 18-year-old guy how to do his match or how to make it better. So this isn't necessarily rules of wrestling, this is rules of everyday life. I was really happy being in the position I was in, being the younger brother of one of the best in Pittsburgh, being the son of one of the best promoters in Pittsburgh. So I really, I definitely would have approached things a little bit differently than I did now. But then again, you learn from your mistakes, and, I think the way that I was has shaped me into who I've become.
Before you started traveling the world, you certainly worked around Western PA for quite a while. Do you have any fun memories of working in Western Pennsylvania?
I absolutely had a blast. I think Pittsburgh was fantastic. Just the guys that I was around was too much fun. Shima Zion, Ashton Amherst, Ryan Mitchell. Some of these guys have traveled just, not even just Pittsburgh, but just the tri-state area, Pittsburgh, Ohio, West Virginia. Had a blast with some of these guys, just having fun being on the road. Nothing too big, but I was always one of these guys that because I was so obsessed with wrestling beforehand, I had a grasp of what was going on everywhere else. So I was always the one that would send out emails and try to get outside of Pittsburgh. And I ended up, sharing a lot of my work. I'd say, hey, can I get 2 or 3 guys to come from Pittsburgh next Saturday night? So some of those road trips were always really fun. But I think working in different areas with different talent always kind of shapes you into a different person. And, if you stay inside the box, you become the box.
At the age of 21, you got signed by the WWE to a developmental deal. What did that mean to you?
At the time, it was the absolute coolest thing that's ever happened to me. Clearly at 21, what else do you want as a wrestler? I'd only been wrestling, 2.5 years at that point. I was signed at 20, and I reported after I was 21, which was really cool. But the whole, I can't say illusion, just the perspective of what I thought it was completely different than what it actually was. So
what does that mean?
Illusions of grandeur, I guess.
Okay.
This is being a 21-year-old kid that basically, in a lot of ways, had everything handed to me, in a sense, from outside perspective. I grew up around wrestling and just, I didn't really ever see the dark side because people were too afraid to show me because I was in a wrestling family and my brother and my dad. So I didn't know how horrible the backstage politics could be and basically having to grow up so fast. So when I got there and realized it was a job, it was work, it was professional, and these aren't your friends, I definitely learned a lot very quickly. So it was the best experience of my life getting that at 21 years old. But, I think getting released was also a great experience because it shaped me into who I've become. And since then, it's opened up so many doors that really have turned me into who I was going to become.
When you got signed, there's no doubt you were pretty much brand new. You were 2 years in the business, maybe almost 3. Your brother at that point had not been signed, but he was pretty widely regarded as one of the best around. Was there any animosity between your brother and yourself at the time that you got signed and he did not?